All right, welcome back everyone to our parenting phases part two. So in part one, we talked about teaching, and then we talked a little bit also about the next phase, directing. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about coaching, advising, and then friendship when it comes to our children. So uh, if we want to look at the third phase, we're talking about coaching. And so here, I don't really like to give like a specific age range, but I would say preteen, teenagers is probably the best time when you want to start coaching your children. So, from my experiences, rather than telling my kids they can or can't do something, and of course, that's not with everything, but when it comes to some of the things that they're going out and about and hanging out with their friends, I try to coach them and give them advice on what's the best decision to make. Try to make the right decisions when no one else is around, and when you're with your friends. For example, alcohol, smoking. People are doing a lot of other things these days when it comes to smoking. I'm trying to think of the word
Maybe.
vaping. Yeah. So, one of the things that I've talked to my boys about, 17 years and 15 years old, is about vaping and drinking. And I try to coach them as opposed to threaten them and tell them that they're going to get in trouble. I try to coach them in terms of why it's not a good idea to drink and why it's not a good idea to smoke or vape at such a young age. I mean, it's not a good idea to do just in general, but especially at a young age when their brains are not completely developed and could cause problems. So, some of the conversations I had with my boys is that, they want to be athletes and they play baseball and football. And what I'm telling them, if they want to be the best that they can be, um, smoking is not going to help them. Vaping is not going to help them, and drinking is not going to help them. So I try to take the approach like if you want to be the best athlete, you want to be better than the others when it comes to these sports, there are other people out there that also want to be the best. And because they're not smoking, vaping, or drinking, they're always going to have that competitive edge. So those are the conversations I've had with my children about, what's good for them and what's not good for them when it comes to coaching. And I don't know, Stephanie, if like you have any examples with, with your son Harrison. He's a bit younger, and of course, Marquis, we would love to hear what you have to say from your experiences as well. But that's one of my examples in terms of, rather than directing them, telling them they can or can't do something, it's more about coaching them and trying to make the right decisions.
Yeah, I think with Harrison, those type of conversations are starting. He starts middle school next year. And so I know middle school kids are doing things that maybe aren't necessarily happening in elementary school. And so I think it's easier to have conversations because he can ask questions. Well, what would happen if, and why can't I, or why shouldn't I? And giving the same type of examples of, well, your brain's developing. If you want to be a good athlete, like same with him, like he's athletic and he wants to play sports and do all the things, and just telling him like those things don't help you get better in those type of situations. But I like at this age because he can ask questions and I don't have to say, you're gonna blah blah, like if you drink or smoke or whatever. It's an actual conversation where he's getting information, because I feel like, yes, we still need to direct and say like that's not good, like you shouldn't do that. But then it's like, well, why can't I? Why are you telling me not to? Versus like having an open conversation about the health risks of doing those, or even like using examples of, people you have in your life that engage in those behaviors and outcomes that maybe not have been the best, or looking at people that he looks up to.
Though. Like when you're saying you shouldn't do that, I still think that's coaching. Direct, like when I think of like the previous phase, directing is like, don't hit your brother or be nice to your sister. You're giving a directive.
True. Okay.
Now, I also want to kind of just clarify. I would use the previous phase if my children started to drink my wife's wine. I would be like, that's just not going to happen, right? I'm not going to coach them there. There's a directive there. The coaching is more about when, adults are not around, and make the right decision is what I tell my children. Make the right decision. When you're out and about, make the right decision. And so I think that's where
Yeah.
coaching comes in.
Yeah, I think I had a conversation with Harrison over the weekend. He was at Knott's Berry Farm with his friends, and the adults were not present, right? They were out probably walking around. And I just said, like, make a good decision. I do not want to get a phone call stating that you got thrown out of the park for engaging in shenanigans and you know better. And he's a good kid and he won't necessarily follow because like, and so like I think having those type of conversations, like he understands what that means and makes the right decision so he doesn't suffer the consequences of whatever shenanigans are. And that's what kids do. But I think having conversations, and I like that, make the right decision, because we're trusting our kids are going to hopefully make
Yeah, I mean, we can't, the truth is we're not going to be able to watch over them all the time, especially when they're getting older. And as they become teenagers, we give them more freedom, to go out and about. So these conversations are very important at this stage. These are conversations that, and when I say they're important at this stage, I mean, we should try to be having conversations with our kids from the very beginning so they feel comfortable coming to us and expressing, their fears and their problems and all of that, so that by the time they're teenagers, they're really comfortable having these conversations with mom and dad. Yeah.
I agree with that.
There's some key differences between the directing and coaching, and some of it you've already talked about. Like directing, you're there, you get to see what happens, versus coaching, you're not there, which also means that any consequences for those actions are very different. In the directing phase, you guys are providing the consequences because you've witnessed what has happened. But in the coaching phase, it's a scary thing for a parent because now the consequences are moving into the natural environment. And if you drink and you get caught by the police, that is a big deal. That's much different than being caught by your parent.
Let's talk about, the conversation I had, it's not just about breaking the law, but the other serious consequences. So when, my son, the 17-year-old, is driving, and, my conversation with him is not about getting caught by the police. It's more about what you could do and the effects that could take place if you're drinking and then you get in a car and you kill another family that's on the road. And we've talked about that, like the impact that it's going to have on that family and the impact that it's going to have on you as the driver and the impact that it's going to have on your family. And I broke that down for him. And, it wasn't an easy conversation, but I said, if you're ever put in a position where you have a sip of something and you have your car, I will, come and pick you up and no questions asked. But if I ever find out that you have a sip of something and you drive, the consequences are going to be pretty severe. So, it's one of those conversations where it's like you go to coaching, but you go back and forth to the previous phase where it's like, okay, here's the directive, but I also want to coach you so you have a better understanding of how to make the right decisions. Mm-hmm. And hopefully as they become young adults, they pass the teenage phase, you get to a point where we talk about this next phase in parenting, where it's like you're coaching them, but you're also trying to advise them, advise them on future plans. So it's not about what we're going to do this weekend with our friends, more about what are we going to do over the next year to better ourselves? What are we going to do over the next 5 years, 10 years, planning our life out. And that's where, you as a parent you become an advisor. And they're going to make their own decisions. And sometimes they'll take your advice, hopefully, and sometimes they won't. And it's okay. They're going to have to learn from experience and make some, financial mistakes, relationship mistakes. But, that's the phase, you get into is where it's advisement.
I will say, before you leave coaching, and this would be a difficult thing. I imagine you guys probably have some stories for this, but in terms of accessing consequences, that they have to access some in order for learning to actually occur. And so you're like, what? I gotta imagine you're weighing that as a parent. What are the consequences that I'm willing to let them access because it's not going to be life changing and they need to learn versus what am I avoiding at all costs? I don't know if you guys have stories to share for that.
I mean, basically what you're saying is, I'm going to allow some eggs to be broken in the kitchen, right?
Yeah.
It's just that as long as you don't light the house on fire when you're cooking, then we're all right. And I mean, I think it has a lot to do with relationships, with the even with all three kids, friendships, and the starting of having a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and you want to be sensitive, to what you say and how you say it. But in that case, for me, with the boys, with both boys, I would coach them, but I'm also trying to be very sensitive to the fact that we have another person involved, and to understand what it's like to be a gentleman, but at the same time, you're in a relationship, and if somebody's not doesn't value who you are or value your time, there's decisions you have to make, and sometimes you have to move on, and sometimes you can do things to repair a relationship. And that's my experience with my boys, not to get into too many details or too long of a story, but just trying to guide them on what it's like to be in a relationship for the first time, and how to handle things.
I've had not relationship with Harrison, but like friendships and what's a good friend and what's not, making friendly choices towards you. And and I tell him, you can continue feeling this way about the friendship and continuing to engage in the behaviors or accepting their behaviors. And you're saying that it's okay by doing this, but so it is kind of touchy, because I don't want to say, no, you can't be friends with them because they're mean, but kind of looking at like the picture and just point out things. And that's more of an advisement of, it doesn't bother. I don't like seeing you upset and crying over a friend that's maybe not making the right choices with you, but that's up to you. I'm just advising you of what I would do if I was in, and it takes some time because they are learning, and what you say, like breaking eggs and finally coming to the realization of like, oh yeah, that I probably shouldn't accept that, or I should say something. And it hurts as a parent to see your kid upset and people not being so nice in his situation. But then at the end, like advising of what my experiences are and kind of seeing that come to full circle of realizing changes that need to be made or conversations that need to be had. That was hard for me as a parent, because I've never had to experience that with him. But I mean, he is getting older, and so I just know that's coming more frequently than probably what I would like at this point.
Didn't have a conversation with my boys, but when they were saying my girlfriend, and I was talking to my wife about my wife, it's like we have to be careful with those possessive pronouns. So saying, like it's not yours. Like, we are dating, right? We are married. But it's hard not to say like, oh, this is my husband, my wife, so and so. And I wanted to make that clear to the boys, because you have to treat, they're your friends, but they're not. Sorry, they're not. They're not your possession, and I think that's important for individuals that are starting in relationships to understand that you can't be possessive, you can't be overly jealous. So it's with coaching. It's like that area of coaching that I think is very important, and also these phases can blend where you're also advising as well. But I know, like with my experience with my parents. I remember when I was in my early 20s, my father was giving me advice, my mother was giving me advice. And, like if I didn't follow the advice, they weren't upset about it. They were just like, well, I mean, you're an adult and don't follow this advice. This is what's going to happen. What I really enjoyed was the phase where I became friends with my parents. And that happened when I was financially independent. And I remember thinking, wow, like when I come over to visit my parents, they will ask me if I want something to drink. Like, you want a glass of wine or a beer? And I'm like, oh, wow, that's crazy. Like, they're treating me more as a friend, that of course I'm their son, who they love. But, it's just an interesting relationship. So, it's like you talk to your friends for it. You can have conversations with your friends and ask for your friends for advice. But, it's interesting to have your parents as advisors. and as friends, because it's a very nice relationship to have.
I agree. I still find myself, I mean, my parents live so, just like your parents live so far away from you. I still find myself texting my mom or calling my mom and like taking pictures of things and sending her like, what do you think this is? What should I do? Because she's had experience and, you know, she's had lifelong experience that I've never had. And so it's nice to be able to have just everyday conversations with her, but by also still being able to like ask for that advice and not, you know, because they're wiser and older than we are. And but to have that going back and forth between the two is, I think, really nice as you get older.
Yeah.
I think technology has changed things a little bit too. I'm going to tease my brother a little bit. If he watches this, he can give me a hard time, but you know, you can watch your family on Find My and stuff like that. And so he's watching, my nephew is in his second year of college. He can see that he's not getting out of bed on time for his classes. He knows that he's not going to make it on time, and they're literally waited in bated breath. Like, do I text him? Do I wake him up? Do I call him? But they're making that choice to be like, okay, he's an adult. He's got to learn. We're not going to call him. We're not going to wake him up. And it's hilarious to watch them go through that. But those are the little nuances for parenting.
Very true. So, just as a quick review in part one, we talked a little bit about when you have your children, you're doing a lot of teaching at the very beginning, and then as they learn these skills, you know, you move on to the next phase where we're directing, you know, telling the children what they can or can't do. So, for example, you know, stop hitting your brother, don't hit your sister, you know, don't spill that, don't eat food on, you know, in the living room. These are all like directives or rules that we apply. And then, you know, the following phase we talked about, and like I said, you know, it's probably around preteen, teenage years. You're trying to coach your children rather than just provide all directives. Of course, you know, these phases will blend. It's not like one phase, there's like a very black and white boundary where you go from teaching, you know, just to directives and then directives into coaching. And then as you know, you're coaching your teenagers as they become young adults, you know, you start to give them advice, you know, whether it's financial advice or advice in relationships. And then finally, when they become financially independent, then you can become friends with them. And I think part of the reason why we're talking about this is there's been a lot of confusion with a lot of parents that we've worked with where, you know, they want to be friends with their kids at a very young age, and it causes a lot of problems. And what we tell people, it's not that you can't be friendly, but keep in mind that the relationship you have is, you know, from, you know, parent to child. You know, our jobs are to provide them, you know, with the guidance necessary to make them good humans. And so when we look at these phases, we talk about teaching, we talk about directives, we talk about coaching, advising, and then finally friendship. So hopefully, you know, this will help and guide you when you're interacting with your children. If you have any comments or questions, please let us know. We appreciate you guys participating in our Parent Like a Professional podcast here. And we hope to see you guys soon. Take care.